There are promises made not in thunder, but in the quiet space between two breaths. This is a story about that space, about the careful, steady mending of a life, and the man who learned that the truest protection is not a gun held ready, but a hand offered, palm up, in the lamplight. It is a story for those who know that the deepest desires are spoken not in grand declarations, but in the simple, hallowed words, "You are safe here." The silence in Elara's homestead was a physical thing. It had weight, pressing in on the pine floorboards and the single neatly made bed. For 2 years, since the fever took John, that silence had been her most constant companion. She moved through it with a practiced economy of motion, her days measured by the sun's slow arc across the dusty yard. The scrape of her chair, the clink of a solitary spoon against a bowl, the sigh of the wind through the dry summer grass, these were the only sounds that punctuated the profound hush. Loneliness was an orderly routine. One cup washed, one plate dried, one set of linens folded and stored away. This evening, the heat of the day clung to the small cabin, thick and still. Lamplight cast a warm, lonely circle on the table where she sat, a needle pulling thread through a worn piece of canvas. Her hands, capable and sure, were the only things in her world that felt truly alive. The rest was waiting. She did not know for what. Outside, the world was a vast, empty canvas of prairie under a sea of stars, and her small, glowing window was a defiant pinprick of existence against the encroaching dark. The bed was made for one. The lamp flickered, casting her shadow, long and solitary, against the wall. A house too silent, a heart too quiet. Then a sound broke the stillness, not the familiar call of a night bird, but the heavy, stumbling gait of a horse pushed past its limit, followed by a dull, solid thud that was unnervingly human. The silence shattered, replaced by the sudden, frantic beat of her own heart. Elara stood on the porch, the warm wood a familiar comfort beneath her bare feet. The old rifle, heavy and cold, was a less familiar weight in her hands. The moon was a sliver, offering little light, but the sound had come from just beyond the fence line, near the well. She held her breath, listening. A low groan confirmed her fear. It was a man. Her first instinct, born of 2 years alone on the edge of nowhere, was to bar the door and douse the lamp. Trouble, in this part of the country, traveled on horseback and often bled. But another instinct, one she thought had been buried with her husband, stirred within her. It was the simple, human need to answer a cry of pain. She moved with cautious steps, the rifle held low but ready. He was a heap of dark clothing and long limbs, tangled with the reins of a fallen horse that was struggling to rise. As she drew closer, the scent of dust, sweat, and blood reached her. He was hurt, badly. "Don't move," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The man stilled, his head lifting just enough for her to see the glint of his eyes in the faint moonlight. He didn't speak, only watched her. She saw the dark stain spreading across his thigh, the unnatural angle of his arm. He wasn't a threat. He was a man broken. A practical choice had to be made, a risk weighed against a conscience. Leaving him for the coyotes felt like a cruelty she could not live with. Bolting the door on him felt like bolting it on the last piece of her own humanity. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of her reserve, she lowered the rifle. "Can you stand?" she asked, the question hanging in the hot, still air. A rasped, one-word answer came back. No. And so, the practical arrangement began. With immense effort, she helped him untangle himself from the weary horse, half dragging, half carrying him the few yards to her cabin. Proximity was forced not by a mistake or an agreement, but by the simple, undeniable fact of his blood staining the dry earth in front of her door. The silent house was silent no more. It held his pained breaths, the scuff of his boot, and the first flicker of a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Silas woke to the scent of soap and drying herbs. For a moment he was adrift, unsure of where he was. The last thing he remembered was the searing pain in his leg as his horse gave way, the ground rushing up to meet him. Now there was a clean sheet beneath him, the muted light of a shuttered window, and a quiet so profound it felt like a blanket. He tried to sit up, and a sharp, grinding fire in his shoulder sent him back down with a choked gasp. Easy. The voice was low and calm. He turned his head. A woman sat in a straight-backed chair a few feet away, a bowl of water on a small stool beside her. Her hands were busy with a strip of clean linen. She wasn't looking at him, but he knew her attention was entirely on him. He took stock of his situation. He was on a cot, not a proper bed. His gun belt was gone. His left arm was tightly bound to his chest, his shoulder immobilized. The wound in his thigh had been cleaned and stitched with neat, precise work. He was disarmed, crippled, and at her mercy. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, coiled in his gut. But as he watched her, it began to recede. She moved with a purpose that left no room for hysterics. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back severely, was serious, her expression unreadable, but not unkind. She was the one who had found him, the one who had brought him in. He had seen the rifle in her hands, and he had seen her lower it. That, more than anything, told him what he needed to know. She finished her task and rose, bringing the bowl to his side. "I need to check the stitches," she said. It wasn't a question. He gave a short, stiff nod. Her touch was firm, professional. Her fingers brushed the skin of his leg, and a jolt went through him that had nothing to do with pain. It was the first gentle touch she had felt in years. When she was done, she met his eyes for the first time. Her gaze was direct, weighing him. "You are safe here," she stated, her tone flat, as if remarking on the weather. It was not a vow. Not yet. It was a statement of fact for the present moment. For now, Silas understood. Safety was conditional, earned. He cleared his throat, his voice a dry rasp. "Thank you." She simply nodded, taking the bowl and turning away. He watched her move across the small, tidy room. She was a woman who knew her own space, who had built a fortress of solitude. And he was the stranger she had, for reasons he could not fathom, allowed inside its walls. The room was quiet again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unsettling, unfamiliar presence of another person's care. 3 days passed in a haze of pain and fitful sleep. On the 4th, Silas felt the fever break. He woke feeling weak, but clear-headed, the world no longer tilted at a strange angle. Elara was at the hearth, her back to him, stirring something in a pot. The smell of broth filled the cabin. He managed to push himself into a sitting position, hissing as his shoulder protested. She heard the sound and turned. She observed him for a long moment, then ladled the broth into a bowl and brought it to him. He took it, his hand clumsy. "My thanks," he said again, the words feeling inadequate. She gave her usual slight nod and returned to her work. The silence between them was a landscape they were both learning to navigate. He was a man of few words by nature. She, it seemed, had been made so by circumstance. He learned her routines through observation. The way she checked the horizon every morning, the methodical manner in which she tended her small garden, the fierce protectiveness with which she guarded her solitude. He was an intrusion, a disruption to her orderly world, and he was determined to be as little of a burden as possible. By the end of the week, he could stand on his own. He insisted on helping. He couldn't use his left arm, but he could shell beans, peel potatoes, and keep the fire fed. They worked in tandem, often without speaking, a silent choreography of shared domestic tasks. Trust was not built with words, but with micro-intimacy. It was in the way she handed him a knife, hilt first, without thinking. It was in the way he took the heavier bucket of water from her, his good hand closing over the handle, just as hers was about to take the strain. One afternoon, she brought out his shirt, washed and dried. There was a long tear in the fabric from his fall. She sat in her chair by the window, the shirt in her lap, and began to mend it. Silas sat at the table, ostensibly sharpening a small blade, but he was watching her. He watched the needle dip and rise, her fingers deft and sure. Each stitch was a small act of restoration, a quiet mending. She was not just repairing cloth. She was reassembling a piece of his life that had been torn open. She seemed to feel his gaze and looked up, her hands stilling in her lap. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between them. For the first time, he saw the fatigue etched around her eyes, the deep loneliness she tried to hide behind her competence. A profound, aching desire to ease that burden rose in him. He knew what it was to be alone. His own guard, so carefully maintained for years, began to crumble at the edges. She held up the shirt, inspecting her work. The seam was a neat, straight line, stronger than the original fabric. A symbol. He felt a shift in the room, a change in the quality of the silence. It was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a space they were beginning to share. The routine they established became a quiet language. Mornings were for chores, afternoons for the steady, companionable work of preserving the garden's modest bounty. Evenings they would sit at the small table, the lamp casting a pool of gold between them, the world outside held at bay by the thin wooden walls. Silas found himself watching her constantly. He watched the way a stray piece of hair would fall across her cheek, and how she would tuck it back with an impatient gesture. He watched the strength in her hands as she kneaded bread, the focused line of her brow as she read from a worn book. He had spent years scanning rooms for threats, his eyes always moving, assessing angles, noting exits. Now he found himself scanning her face for signs of need or comfort. The instinct to protect, so long channeled into violence and vigilance, was softening, transforming into something else, something quieter and far more powerful. He started to notice the small things. She always took the chipped mug for herself, leaving him the whole one. He began to intercept it, taking the chipped one before she could. The first time he did it, she paused, her hand hovering over the mugs, and looked at him. A silent question passed between them. He simply held her gaze until she took the one he offered. A small battle of unspoken care, a tiny victory of tenderness. Guardedness was slowly, almost imperceptibly, shifting to longing. He found himself wanting to know the story behind the sadness in her eyes, to understand the source of her fierce independence. He wanted to make her smile. One evening, she was struggling to thread a needle in the dim light. Her frustration was a quiet, tense line in her shoulders. Without a word, he rose, took the needle and thread from her, and held them up to the lamplight. His larger, rougher fingers were surprisingly steady as he guided the thread through the tiny eye. He handed it back to her. Their fingers brushed. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a shock of warmth through him. He saw a faint blush rise on her cheeks before she turned her head away. He returned to his seat, his heart hammering in his chest. The air in the cabin was thick with all the things they did not say. He wanted to reach across the table, to take her hand, to tell her. What? That he saw her, that she was not alone. But the words wouldn't come. He was a man who spoke with actions, not poetry. So he sat in the charged silence, his yearning a palpable presence in the room, and simply watched over her as she sewed. The knock on the door came like a gunshot in the quiet of the late afternoon. They both froze. Visitors were not a feature of Elara's life. Silas instinctively moved, placing himself between her and the door, his body a silent shield. Elara put a hand on his good arm. "It's all right," she murmured, though her voice was tight. "I know who it is." She opened the door to reveal a man in a waistcoat and polished boots, that seemed entirely out of place in the dusty yard. He was handsome in a soft, predatory way, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Elara, my dear," he said, his voice overly familiar. "I was in the area. Thought I'd see if you needed anything." This was Mr. Croft, the man who held the note on her land, the man who had made it clear he considered her and her homestead part of the debt. Croft's eyes slid past her, landing on Silas. His smile tightened. "You have company." "I do," Elara said, her voice cool and level. She did not step aside to let him in. Croft's gaze raked over Silas, taking in his bound arm, the worn clothes, the quiet intensity. "A hired hand?" he asked, a sneer in his tone. "An interesting choice." Silas said nothing. He simply stood there, a solid, immovable presence. He could feel the tension radiating from Elara, the effort it took for her to maintain her composure. He recognized Croft for what he was, a predator who used civility as a weapon. After a few more minutes of oily pleasantries that Elara deflected with curt, non-committal answers, Croft finally left, his parting glance a clear threat. Elara closed the door, her back to Silas, her shoulders rigid. The silence that fell was heavy, full of the man's lingering poison. Silas waited. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice low. "He thinks because I am alone, I am his for the taking." The admission hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The unspoken threat from the outside had breached their quiet sanctuary. Elara was restless, her movements sharp and jerky. As it grew dark, she did not prepare the cot for him as she usually did. She stood by the hearth, her arms wrapped around herself. "The nights are growing colder," she said, not looking at him. It was a statement of fact, but it held a deeper meaning. Silas knew what she was offering. It wasn't about passion. It was about safety, about propriety, about presenting a united front against the world that was pressing in. It was a choice to deepen their closeness, born of necessity but offered with quiet dignity. "You can sleep in the main room," she clarified, her voice barely a whisper. "On the floor, by the fire, where it's warmer, where I can see the door." He understood. He would be her guardian, her watchman. It was an invitation, an honest vow to remain, and a mutual, explicitly consensual choice. "Only if you want," he said, his own voice rough with emotion. He was giving her the final say, reinforcing her agency. She finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his in the flickering lamplight. "I want," she said. And with that simple, plainly spoken word, the foundation of their arrangement shifted, becoming something solid, something shared, something that might, with time, become a home. The trip to town was a necessity. Elara's supplies were low, and Silas, though his leg was healing, needed a proper tonic for the lingering ache. The decision to go together was unspoken but understood. For her to be seen alone now, after Croft's visit, would be an invitation for more gossip, more pressure. For him to go alone was impossible. So they rode in her small buckboard, the silence between them comfortable, a familiar rhythm. But the moment they reached the dusty main street of Redemption, the atmosphere changed. Every window seemed to have eyes. Whispers followed them like burrs on a blanket. The sight of the reclusive widow, with a scarred, quiet stranger by her side, was a feast for the town's gossips. Elara held her head high, her back straight, but Silas could see the faint tremor in her hands as she gripped her basket. He stayed close, a step behind her, his presence a silent declaration. Inside the general store, the pressure became a tangible thing. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, gave them a look that mixed pity and condemnation. Then Croft appeared, as if summoned. He cornered Elara near the flour barrels, his voice low and proprietary. "You're making a mistake, Elara. A woman in your position needs a respectable protector, not him." He gestured dismissively toward Silas. Silas saw the flash of fear in Elara's eyes, quickly masked by anger. Before she could speak, he stepped forward, placing himself partially in front of her. He didn't touch Croft, didn't say a word. He simply met the other man's gaze. His eyes, flat and cold, held a history of violence that Croft, for all his bluster, could only imitate. It was a plain, nonverbal promise of consequences. Croft, a bully at his core, faltered. He took a half-step back, his sneer wavering. He tried to recover, puffing out his chest. "This is a private conversation." It was Elara who answered. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the tension. "No, it's not." She moved to stand beside Silas, her shoulder brushing his arm. A small movement, a universe of meaning. It was a choice, made in public. She was aligning herself with him, declaring them a unit. "We're leaving," she said, her eyes fixed on Croft. They gathered their things and left the store, the silence behind them more telling than any shout. A walk back to the buckboard was a gauntlet of stairs. But this time, something was different. Elara's hand was no longer trembling. Silas felt a fierce, protective pride swell in his chest. She had not let Croft intimidate her. She had stood her ground, and she had stood with him. Their bond, forged in the quiet of the homestead, had just been tested by social fire, and it had held. The ride back to the homestead was quiet, but the air in the buckboard was charged with the aftermath of the confrontation. The unspoken had become spoken. The private had become public. When they arrived, the familiar quiet of the cabin felt different. It was a sanctuary they had fought for together. Elara moved about the kitchen, putting away their supplies with sharp, deliberate movements. Silas watched her, sensing the storm of emotion she was holding back. He waited until she was done, until she stood staring out the small window at the setting sun, her hands braced on the sill. "He has no right," she said, her voice tight with a fury that had been simmering for 2 years. "My husband worked this land for nothing. He built this house with his own hands, and Croft acts as if it's already his." Silas came to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his steady presence. The time for silence was over. "Elara," he said, his voice low and serious. She turned from the window to face him. The last of the sunlight caught in her hair, and in that moment he knew he could no longer keep his own secrets. What had started as a need for refuge had become a duty, and that duty had become a devotion. "Croft is the reason I was on that road," he began. Her eyes widened slightly. "I wasn't running from the law. I was running to it." He moved to the small pack he had kept by his cot, the one thing of his she had not searched. From it, he pulled a worn, leather-bound ledger. He placed it on the table between them. "I was a deputy in Blackstone County," he explained, his words coming slowly, carefully. "Croft has been buying up foreclosed properties for years, using fraudulent claims and forged papers. He forces people out, pays them pennies, and resells the land to the railroad for a fortune. He ruined a dozen families back there." He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat columns of names, dates, and figures. It was a meticulous record of theft. "Your husband's name is in here," Silas said gently. He pointed to an entry. "John Miller. Croft doctored the loan papers after your husband died. The debt he claims you owe. It isn't real. This ledger is the proof." The confession settled in the lamplit room. Elara stared at the book, then up at him, her face a mask of shock, then dawning comprehension, and a slow, burning anger on behalf of the man she had lost. The backstories were revealed, the emotional doors thrown wide open. He was not a wounded outlaw. He was an agent of justice. His protection was not a coincidence. It was his purpose. "He sent men after me," Silas finished. "That's how I was injured. I was trying to get this to the U.S. Marshal in Silver Creek." Elara slowly reached out and placed her hand on the ledger, as if to absorb the truth of it. All the pieces clicked into place. Croft's entitlement, his pressure, his confidence. "You came here to help," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "I came here because my horse gave out," he corrected her, his gaze intense. "I stayed because of you." The revelation of the ledger changed everything. The dynamic between them, already shifting from caretaker and patient to that of allies, now settled into a true partnership. The threat of Croft was no longer just a shadow over Elara's home. It was a battle they were meant to fight together. The intimacy that grew in the following days was deeper, rooted in a shared purpose and a profound, validated trust. He was no longer just a man she was sheltering. He was the man who held the key to her freedom, and she was the woman who had, by sheer chance, become his sanctuary. The quiet moments became more frequent, more charged. One evening, as she was putting away her sewing, the needle slipped, pricking her finger. A single drop of crimson welled up. "Ah!" She gasped, more in surprise than pain. Before she could move, Silas was there. He gently took her hand, his thumb pressing against the small wound to staunch the bleeding. His touch was so careful, so deliberate, it made her breath catch. "Hold still," he murmured. He guided her to the table, and from a small tin, he took a clean strip of cloth and a jar of salve. His large, scarred hands, which she knew were capable of felling a tree or firing a gun, were impossibly tender as he cleaned the tiny cut and wrapped it. He held her hand in his for a moment longer than was necessary, his head bowed over her fingers. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the steady, reassuring strength in his grip. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the longing that had been building between them for weeks. He didn't release her hand. Instead, his thumb stroked slowly, reverently, over her knuckles. It was a question, asked without a single word. He was asking for permission to touch her, to comfort her, to simply be with her in this quiet moment. A yes was a monumental thing. It was a surrender of the guard she had kept for so long. It was an acceptance of the tenderness he offered. It was a choice. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her fingers curled slightly, returning the pressure of his hold. A silent, answered consent. A slow smile, the first genuine, unguarded smile he had ever shown her, touched his lips. It transformed his stoic face, revealing a warmth she had only glimpsed before. "Elara," he said, her name a soft, reverent sound in the quiet room. It wasn't a statement or a question. It was a prayer. In that moment, holding her hand in the lamplight, he was no longer a protector, and she was no longer a survivor. They were simply a man and a woman, their private world shrinking to the small, hallowed space between their joined hands. They knew he would come. It was only a matter of when. 3 days after their trip to town, 2 riders appeared on the horizon, kicking up a cloud of dust that was visible for miles. It was Croft and one of his hired men. Elara's heart began to hammer against her ribs, but when she looked at Silas, his calm settled her. He was not reaching for a weapon. He simply stood on the porch, waiting. Croft reined in his horse, a triumphant sneer on his face. He dismounted, holding a sheaf of papers. "This is it, Elara. An official eviction notice, signed by the circuit judge. You have 24 hours to vacate the premises. The property reverts to me to settle your husband's outstanding debt." He waved the papers like a flag of conquest. Elara stepped forward, moving to stand beside Silas. Her voice was clear and steady when she spoke. "There is no outstanding debt." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The judge seems to think so. It's all here in black and white." "So is this," Silas said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. He stepped back into the cabin for a moment and returned with the ledger. He didn't open it. He simply held it. Croft's eyes fixed on the leather-bound book, and the color drained from his face. He recognized it. The sneer faltered, replaced by a flicker of pure panic. That's nothing. Lies. Is it? Silas asked. It's a very detailed account of your business practices. Names, dates, forged signatures. I imagine the U.S. Marshal in Silver Creek will find it very interesting reading, especially the part about the railroad contracts. This was the climax, the decisive confrontation. It wasn't fought with bullets, but with truth and paper. It was a battle of wills, and Croft's was crumbling. He looked from the ledger in Silas's hand to the unwavering resolve on Elara's face. He saw them standing together, a united front, an unbreakable partnership. He saw it in the way their shoulders were almost touching, in the single shared glance that passed between them. A wordless signal of trust and support. He was defeated. He had come with the law on his side, only to be confronted with justice. Elara delivered the final blow. Her words were not a plea or a threat, but a plain vow, a declaration of her chosen place. "This is my home," she said, her eyes locked on Croft, "and he is with me." That simple statement sealed it. He is with me. It was an assertion of partnership, of belonging. Croft stared at them, his face a mask of fury and impotence. He knew he had lost. Without another word, he snatched the reins of his horse, mounted, and rode away, his hired man trailing behind him like a dog. The dust settled. The threat was gone. They were alone again, standing on the porch of the home they had just saved together. The immediate aftermath was silence. The wide, empty prairie seemed to be holding its breath. The tension of the confrontation, a coiled spring in both their chests, slowly began to unwind. Croft was gone. The papers he'd left on the ground were just paper, meaningless now. The power they held had been broken. Silas turned to Elara, his first thought, his only thought, for her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. She could only nod. The words caught in her throat. The adrenaline that had kept her steady began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep weariness in its wake. She looked at Silas and saw that the fight had taken a toll on him too. Though his face was calm, his good hand was clenched into a fist at his side, the knuckles white. It was a small, telling detail, an unguarded glimpse of the violence he kept leashed within him. She reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed her hand over his. "Silas," she said softly. Her touch was a question. He met her gaze, and the tension in his hand eased. He uncurled his fingers, turning his palm up to meet hers. They stood like that for a long moment, hands joined, simply breathing in the quiet. It was an act of aftercare, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had weathered. Later, inside the cabin, the falling action of the day continued in small, tender gestures. The lamplight felt warmer, the silence softer. She saw a smudge of ink on his fingers from where he had handled the ledger. She took a cloth and a bowl of warm water, and without a word, began to wash his hands. He let her, his gaze fixed on her face as she performed the simple, intimate task. He had come into her life wounded and bleeding. She had tended to him. Now, she was cleansing away the remnants of a different kind of fight. When she was done, he held her wrist, his thumb stroking her pulse. A steadying touch, a thank you. In the kitchen's golden light, she cut a slice of the bread she had baked that morning and held it out to him. He took it from her fingers, his eyes never leaving hers. They fed each other, a simple meal in the quiet of their kitchen, an unspoken communion. The danger had passed, leaving behind not fear, but a deep and abiding tenderness. They had chosen each other, and now, in the quiet aftermath, they were tending to the small, invisible wounds the world had left behind. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of peace settled over the homestead. The ledger was sent with a trusted freighter to the marshal in Silver Creek, and word eventually came back that Croft's empire of paper and fear had been dismantled. But that was a distant echo. The real victory was the life they were building within the four walls of the cabin. The routines they had established as strangers evolved into the shared rhythms of a partnership. His presence was no longer a temporary arrangement, but a permanent feature of the landscape of her life. The quiet was no longer a sign of loneliness, but of contentment. One afternoon, Elara came out onto the porch to find Silas working on the front door. The old hinge had always been loose, a minor annoyance she had never found the time to fix. He was carefully setting a new pin, his movements precise and focused. He was mending her home, shoring up its foundations, making it secure. It was a symbol of everything he had become to her. He was not just a protector, he was a builder, a restorer. Service was his love language, and he was fluent in it. She brought him a cup of cool water. He took it, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a now familiar smile. As he drank, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. He pressed it into her palm. It was a bird, carved from a piece of scrap pine, its wings slightly upturned as if just taking flight. It was small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, but it was rendered with incredible care and detail. A token, a promise. For you, he said simply. She closed her hand around it, the smooth wood warm against her skin. It was a gift of his time, his skill, his thought. It was everything. They stood in the warm afternoon sun, the future stretching out before them, a clean, unwritten page. The marshal's letter mentioned, "There's a position for a deputy in redemption," she said, her voice quiet. It was a question about his plans, about their future. He set down his tools and turned to face her fully. He took her free hand, his gaze serious and unwavering. "My place is here," he said. It was not a grand declaration, but a plain vow, spoken in the language of simple truth. "If you'll have me." Elara's heart, so long quiet and guarded, felt full to bursting. She looked from his earnest face to the small wooden bird in her hand, to the newly mended door of their home. A named home, a found family, a chosen future. She lifted her hand and rested it against his jawline, a gesture of profound intimacy and acceptance. "I'll have you," she whispered. Their future was sealed not with a kiss, but with that quiet promise, the weight of the carved bird in her hand, and the sight of two mugs, side by side, waiting on the kitchen table in the lamplight.